Let me show you an example for what's going wrong in our application. In persons.js, I have shouldComponentUpdate, and I return true, which means by default, whenever something changes here on this component, whenever it gets re-rendered, then we update. Now, persons.js already gets re-rendered when in app.js something changes, because persons is in the end a child component of app.js. We do include it there. So whenever we change something in app.js, even if that only affects the cockpit or anything else in app.js, but not persons, the person's child still gets re-rendered because that render function here gets called, and therefore this whole function executes and React will go through that entire component tree. That is how it works, and that is how it makes sense logically, because this is a function, it gets executed from top to bottom. So persons gets re-rendered when something changes. And a good example is here in our application, when this reloads, when I toggle my persons, and I then remove the cockpit, which only affects the cockpit, but not the persons. Still here, we see persons shouldComponentUpdate, persons rendering, every single person renders, get snapshot before update, persons component did update. So all our persons updating hooks ran, even though in persons, nothing changed. Would be good if we can prevent this, wouldn't it? Now we can prevent this by simply checking what changed in shouldComponentUpdate, here in persons.js, for example. So here I can check if next props, and now what? Let's have a look at which props we use. We're using persons. So we can check if next props persons is actually different to this props persons, which is our current set. If that is the case, then I want to return true. And yes, I could have just returned the result of that operation. Else, I will return false. Now let's save that and let's try that again. The app restarts. I toggle my persons, and now I remove the cockpit. And now we see persons.js shouldComponentUpdate still gets executed, but nothing else. If I do type in here now, then we go through all the other updating hooks, because now persons really changed. That is super powerful, because that can already save us in performance. For that removal of the cockpit, we did not go through the entire persons component tree to re-render that virtually. Instead, we just skip, because we know if the persons prop doesn't change, then there is no need to re-render, because the persons prop is the only thing we're using in here. So if that is unchanged, this certainly doesn't need to be re-rendered. And that is how you should use shouldComponentUpdate. Now, one important note about this check though. Persons, of course, is an array. And arrays, just like objects in JavaScript, are reference types. Attached, you find a helpful article I created in case you're not sure what I mean by that. In short, the idea here is that reference types, so arrays and objects, are stored in memory, and what you actually store in variables and properties here are only pointers at that place in memory. So what we do compare here is actually the pointer. If something in that person component changed and the pointer is still the same, then this update wouldn't run. And the only reason why it does run here is because in app.js, when I do update my persons, like here with name changed handler, I do actually create a copy of the person I want to change. And then I create a copy of that person's array, and hence I create a new person object and a new array object. And that occupies a new place in memory and gets a new pointer. And therefore the pointers now also differ. If I wouldn't have updated it like this, and instead I would have just manipulated the old array, and therefore the object in memory would be the same, even if some property of it changed, but the place in memory would be the same, then our shouldComponentUpdate check would not work, because it doesn't deeply compare this. It doesn't look at all the properties in persons or in all the objects in persons. It just does a shallow comparison, which means it compares whether these two values here really are the same. And the values are our pointers here. And it works because I updated it correctly by replacing the objects. If you didn't do that, well, then you would have a problem here. And again, watch that attached video or have a look at this attached article if you want to learn more about reference types and how they work. shouldComponentUpdate, super important here, can us help save performance. Please also note, if I reload here, that in Chrome, you can actually go to More Tools and then Rendering. And there you can enable paint flashing. That can be useful because it allows you to see what really gets re-rendered, because it's highlighted with a green look then. So if I now click on here, you see a green flash. This was really rendered in the real DOM. So this is what gets rendered in the real DOM and not what gets rendered virtually by React. And if I now temporarily actually comment this out and I return true all the time so that we do have that redundant re-rendering, then you will see that if I now remove the cockpit, this still, well, it did touch these elements because they were shifted up basically, but it didn't re-render them in the DOM. And a better example maybe is with the cockpit there. If I toggle this and I type into a person, you see the cockpit up there with person manager and so on. This does not change at all. So this is not really changed in the DOM. Though you can clearly see here that the cockpit rendered again in React. So the cockpit functional component, that code did run again. Otherwise, we wouldn't see that output here on the right. But it never made it into the real DOM because there is a difference between how React updates the internal virtual DOM and how it then actually reaches out to the real DOM. So even if we're not doing that performance optimization, we still don't hit the real DOM with every keystroke, which is good. But it's even better if we can make this performance optimization. And you'll learn more about that re-rendering process React does internally in the next lectures.